Okay, so we're discussing quadratic inequalities. So these are similar to linear inequalities. The way we graph these is we're going to graph the boundary curve and then shade one side depending on the inequality. So since this is in standard form, the best thing to do is find the vertex, which is using that formula, negative b over 2a. So here we get negative 4 over 2 times 1, and that comes out to negative 2. And to find the y value, we plug in negative 2. Negative 2 squared plus 4 times negative 2 plus 3, and that comes out to negative 1. So we have a vertex, negative 2, negative 1. And then, since this is in standard form, remember the plus 3 is the y-intercept. So my y-intercept is here. And then I can use the fact that parabolas are symmetric about the vertex to find the other point. So here's this would be my line of symmetry, right? So if I have a point 2 this way, point 2 that way, then I also have a point 2 that way. So we have a point here, and we can draw our parabola. Now, since it's a less than, that means for any point that I pick, I'm going to shade the area below it. So if I go down from this point, then I'm just going to shade every part that include, like everything below, right? So below this point, so it's all of this area that ends up shaded. So really everything outside the parabola gets shaded. All right, number 2, same idea. We're going to start by finding the vertex. You have to be careful with the negatives in this one. So x-coordinate will be negative 2 over 2 times negative 1. That ends up coming out to negative 1. The y value is negative 1 squared minus 2 times negative 1 plus 8, and that ends up as 9. So vertex is negative 1, positive 9. And again, there's my y-intercept. And I can just use symmetry to get that point. And then I'm done. Now, since this one's a less than or equal to, we use a dotted line for this graph. And it's less than, so that means instead of shading somewhere above, I'm going to pick a point. I go straight down. And again, I'm shading the area that's below the parabola. And since this one's opening downwards, the area below the parabola is also the area inside the parabola. All right. So when we have one variable, then what we do is solve them algebraically. And in this case, this first one we have is nice and factorable. So we have, it's less than or equal to, but we really don't have to worry about the less than sign until the end of the problem. So I'm just going to solve it as though it's equals 0. And then, so this one's factorable. So 2 times negative 6 is negative 12. I need to find numbers that multiply to negative 12 and add to negative 1. And that's going to be negative 4 and positive 3. So I have 2x squared minus 4x plus 3x minus 6. And then factor out my GCFs. So I get that it factors to 2x plus 3 and x minus 2. Which means that my two values where it equals 0 would be x is negative 3 halves and x equals 2. So this is where it equals 0. But what I really want to know is where it is less than or equal to 0. So to do that, I'm just going to picture the graph, right? So I know the graph of this is going to look something like this. And it's going to cross at negative 3 halves. And it's going to cross at positive 2. So the part where it's below would be this, right? So that's between negative 3 halves and positive 2. So that means the answer to this question is negative 3 halves is less than or equal to x. It's less than or equal to 2. If this had been a greater than sign initially, then we would just switch these. So if we were solving greater than, now we'd be wanting then we would be wanting this part. So we would say x is less than negative 3 halves, or x is greater than or equal to 2. We can't write this one as a compound inequality because it's split into two different parts, as opposed to this answer, the entire thing is one section of the graph. This is two separate sections that aren't connected. Okay, so lastly, a word problem here. So we have a projectile, and we want to know when it's within 3 meters of the ground. So that means I want to know when is the height less than or equal to 3. So I'm solving this negative 16t squared plus 56t plus 75, and I want to know when that is less than or equal to 3. And remember, I don't really care about the less than sign until the end of the problem. So what we can do is we're just going to pretend it's equals for now. So plus 56t, and I am going to subtract 3 from both sides. Plus 72 equals 0. Now, this quadratic, conveniently, all of these numbers are divisible by a negative 8. So, divide everything by negative 8. And I divided by negative because I really don't like dealing with negative leading coefficients. And also, that is going to end up flipping this inequality. So, now we have positive 2t squared minus 9t. Just kidding, that's not 9. 7t and minus 9. And now we can factor this one. This is going to become minus 9t plus 2t minus 9. So 2 factoring out a t from the first pair gives us 2t minus 9. 1, 2t minus 9. we get t plus 1 times 2t minus 9 equals 0. So t is -1, or t is 4.5. So I said flip here, but since we actually didn't solve it as an inequality, let's go back to our original. So our original one was here, right? So the negative one, we can't have negative times. We already know that's no good. So now, again, let's picture what this graph looks like. So we know it's a negative downward opening parabola, and the projectile is launched, and it's going to look something like that, right? And then we solved and we found it equals 3 right here. So let's say this is when it equals 3. And we know that that point is 4.5. So it's going down, so that means the graph is lower than 3. The height is less than 3 when the time is greater than or equal to 4.5. So you have to be careful because the answer on these problems, the sign won't necessarily match the sign that you started with, right? So you have to, it always helps me to visualize these as graphs, and then I don't get the sign wrong because I see on the graph that in this, like, because this parabola is shaped like this, it's going to be greater than 4, or it's going to be lower than 3, so this was my 3 line, as the time increases. So this is time, and this is height. Okay.